Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming back to you from Breckenridge, Colorado. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. On today's episode, we have Raquel Bennett, PsyD. Dr. Bennett is a postdoctoral fellow in clinical psychology working under the supervision of Dr. Bravo. Dr. Bennett primarily works with people who are experiencing severe depression, who are on the bipolar spectrum, or who are contemplating suicide. She has been studying the therapeutic properties of ketamine since she first encountered it in 2002. In addition to her clinical work, Dr. Bennett's practice has evolved to include consultation services for medical professionals who wish to add ketamine services to their offices. She also lectures frequently about therapeutic ketamine. Dr. Bennett is the founder of Kriya Institute and the organizer of the Kriya conference. So this is a really interesting episode, and we get into a lot more about ketamine and ketamine-assisted therapies. I learned a lot talking to Raquel Bennett here. It's pretty amazing how much I learned and was interested in what Raquel was sharing with me. So I hope you all enjoy it, and definitely check out the Kriya Institute, the Ketamine Research Institute. So KriyaInstitute.com, and you can find out more. Let me read you some ads real quick. If you want to support us, we've got another series of courses coming up. So we have done a really great job with the class lately. Navigating psychedelics. We've got a physician's course running, a therapist and clinicians course running, and a general live cohort. And it's pretty amazing what's been going on there. A lot of deep learning. Some people are getting really deep insights into their past experiences in the course. And there's just an amazing amount of stuff going on there. It's a very intense learning experience because there's a lot of pre-recorded lecture, and the live classroom time really helps clarify any kind of problems people might have with the content. And we are also supporting the class through a Slack group. Slack is just another way to chat with everybody in the class in real time, including us. It supports kind of group chat. It's got kind of focused chat depending on what topic you want to talk about. So yeah, it's been a really great experience. So the various courses, there's one summer cohort. It kicks off on July 18. We have a fall cohort starting on September 12, and a second fall cohort starting on November 7. So if you are interested in learning with us, please do check it out. psychedelicstoday.com, click online education up top, and you are there. So we'd love to have you on the course, and it's just been a very rewarding experience to dig in on this stuff with people in real time, and I think you will appreciate it. All right, so I think that's it for now. Without further ado, here is Raquel Bennett. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Raquel Bennett of the Kriya Institute. Thanks for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
You are quite welcome. So I guess to get started, can we talk first about the Kriya Institute and what the Kriya Institute is about?
Sure. Kriya Institute is my business. It is devoted to understanding how to work with ketamine specifically in psychiatry and psychotherapy. So under the house of Kriya Institute, there are a couple of services. We provide direct clinical services to patients. I do a lot of training and teaching and mentorship for other clinicians. And finally, I run Kriya Conference. Kriya Conference is the annual and international gathering for all of the senior ketamine researchers and clinicians. So we come together once a year in November in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we compare notes and we try to help each other. Specifically, we talked about what we did in the past year with respect to ketamine specifically, and what worked well and what didn't work. It's a collaborative meeting, and this year, 2019, this will be the 5th time that I'm doing that event, if you can believe that.
It's outstanding.
Yeah, I actually have one more program coming to Kriya Institute that I've never mentioned before, but this seems like a good time to talk about it. We're trying to put together a patient assistance fund to make it possible for more people to access ketamine treatment. So more details will be out about that probably in 6 months, but that's the fourth program that's coming to Kriya Institute.
Great. That's awesome. Ketamine's a funny topic, right? It's like so somewhat polarizing, but I think it's an essential medicine in the toolkit of psychedelic psychology, psychiatry, etc. It's
well, so ketamine certainly is a very weird medicine. It's a very weird experience, and it's a very unique medicine. It really, in my opinion, it really falls under the umbrella or under the category of psychiatry. I think that's where this medicine fits the best in terms of legal use. It's a funny thing. A lot of people have prejudice against ketamine. I'm not exactly sure what that's about. A lot of people say that it's not a real psychedelic. And when I hear that, I only can sort of have one response, which is, I don't think you're doing it right. But seriously, no, ketamine is really a challenge. We can talk about that. It's unlike any other tool. It's legal. It's available now, but it's unlike any other tool that's available in psychiatry. And it really requires special patient selection and patient preparation and provider training to do it safely and effectively. And so hopefully we'll talk about all of that today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's so the one somewhat valid critique outside of a clinical setting is it's like quote unquote the addictive psychedelic. I think that could be said about MDMA in the same kind of way in a recreational environment, though in a clinical environment with careful supervision, I don't think that's actually a problem.
This is such a good question. Gosh, there's a lot to say about this, but let's dive into this as long as we're bringing it up. So there's no evidence that ketamine is physically addictive. And what I mean, it's not dopaminergic enough. It doesn't hit the dopamine pathway hard enough. So most things that cause physical addiction and specifically cause withdrawal when you take something and then stop taking it, usually they're pretty heavy hitting in the dopamine pathway. That's not the case with ketamine. And specifically when we give people ketamine in a therapeutic and supervised context, there's no evidence that people are experiencing withdrawal or addiction or physiological dependence. That said, it is, of course, possible to become psychologically addicted to ketamine and to the escape that it provides. But when that happens, I think of that as a property of the person and not a property of the object. And so what I mean by that is, I think it's possible to become addicted to anything, to television, to sex. Some people are addicted to going to the gym. And I think of that as a property of the person, something that they're struggling with psychologically. But that doesn't mean that those objects are inherently addictive, right, or that they can't be used safely by the majority of people. So I happen to think that ketamine is in that category. I don't think it's inherently addictive, but of course it's important to be thoughtful and cautious about it nonetheless.
Right. Gabor Mate's addiction of buying too many classical albums that he writes about.
Exactly.
His wife doesn't find out. Yeah. And addiction treatment. Carl Jung at one point said the treatment for diptomania, I think that's alcoholism's name way back then, is religomania. So kind of substituting alcoholism for God, and which is in a lot of ways what AA might be, with some accountability.
Well, we'll see. The one thing about ketamine that is, what do I want to say? The thing about this is that because it can take you very far out very quickly. And because the recovery time, or because the length of the journey is probably shorter than some of the other classic psychedelics, that does lend itself to getting into a problematic use pattern. It's probably easier to hide, I think. So recreational use is not really my forte. Mm-hmm. But I think it's smart for all of us to be cautious and thoughtful about what we're doing with our bodies and keeping ourselves and our friends safe.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we can all agree on that. So let's talk about you.
Okay.
You are one of the bigger names, if not the biggest name in ketamine right now. I don't know of anybody else who's really focusing on ketamine so much, other than who is it, like Wolfson, that did that ketamine paper or ketamine papers book. But let's talk about you.
Yeah, well, just as a note, that book actually came out of the original Kriya conference.
Oh, great!
That was the origin, of that first book. So we're connected in that way. But let's see, talk about me. Okay, well, I'm obsessed with ketamine. I first encountered it in 2002 at a time when I was really struggling with severe depression. So that's about 17 years ago. And at that time, I had had some psychotherapy. I'd had quite a bit of psychiatric medication. And those things were modestly helpful, but not helpful enough. I was still really depressed. And a friend of mine who was a physician took me to see a psychedelic shaman. And the two of them, it's kind of a long story, but the short version is that between the two of them, they were able to give me some ketamine. And in my first experience with it, it did something amazing to my brain. And I wanted to know if that thing that it did that felt helpful and that relieved the suicidal ideation and the severe depression. And again, this was in a supervised and therapeutic context. But I wanted to know if that thing that it did for me, if that was replicable. Was it just a fluke? Was that something that happened to other people? Was that something that we could do again for me? What in the heck happened? That was really what I wanted to know. And I became interested in studying this particular material because it was helpful to me personally. And my interest, as I said, grew into an obsession. And bim, bam, boom, here we are, 17 years later. I am passionate about this topic.
Where did you do your psychology degree?
Yeah, I have a doctoral degree from Argosy University, located in Alameda. That location is now closed, so the school isn't even there. But I went to a school here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I have a doctoral degree in clinical psychology. And my training has two components. Most of my training was in the diagnosis and treatment of people who are living with refractory or treatment-resistant mood disorders. So that would include people who are living with severe depression or people who are bipolar. And I'm particularly interested in unusual presentations of bipolar disorder. And finally, people who are living with active suicidal ideation. So there's a lot of overlap between those people in those situations. So that's really what I feel called to do, is to try to be helpful to those folks. And then in addition, I also have training in psychoanalytically oriented psychotherapy. At one point, I thought I was going to be a psychoanalyst, but the universe had other plans for me. I will tell you this. I certainly did not plan to be world famous for psychedelic drugs. That was not the career trajectory that I had imagined for myself. But again, sometimes these things just sort of happen. These things show up, and bim, bam, boom, here we are.
Outstanding. So backing up a little bit, your first somewhat psychedelic session that was guided, was that with ketamine, or?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's correct. Well, I had tried a whole bunch of other. Let me go back and clarify. Sure. I had tried a whole bunch of conventional treatment originally for over a decade with very minimal success. And I was really at the edge of my rope. I was just barely alive. I was really suffering. And so I went for a course of psychedelic psychotherapy using other materials, which were completely not helpful and probably harmful. And so that's a whole story unto itself. And I was ready to give up and throw in the towel and potentially kill myself. And my teachers said that they wanted to try one other thing. And so they gave me some ketamine. And it's kind of a funny story because they were not giving it to me for its antidepressant properties, because it wasn't known at that time that ketamine had antidepressant properties. On the contrary, when I reported my experience, all the psychiatrists that I knew said that it was impossible, that there was no such thing, and that there would never be any kind of a rapid-acting antidepressant agent. And I knew that wasn't right. And I'll tell you why. Partly because I had this amazing experience myself, but also because you can look around at heroin and cocaine and some of these other things that clearly have rapid-acting mood modulation properties. Whether those things are productive or whether those things are therapeutic is a different question. But it was obvious to me that there are things that are rapid-acting. So anyway, that's how I got interested in studying this. I'm going off on a tangent here, but back to the question.
Fine. Yeah.
Right on. Thanks for your patience. So back to the ketamine. So here's the thing. At the time that my teachers gave me ketamine, I remember them saying, I remember it vividly. They said, we don't use this very often. We don't know how it works, but sometimes it's helpful in a case like yours with, refractory depression and suicidal ideation. And so I was totally desperate. I was out of options. I had tried conventional stuff. I had tried psychedelic stuff. I had tried some other really weird stuff, and nothing really worked until ketamine. But in any case, the day that they gave me ketamine the first time, as I said, we were not seeking an antidepressant effect per se. We didn't know that it could do that. But rather, what we were trying to do, the goal was to help me connect with the universe or the cosmos in a psychedelic way, to help me find a way to go on in the face of extreme mental suffering. And so it was really an existential quest to figure out, why had this happened to me? Why was I having such severe depression? And how was I going to live with it? And was there a lesson in it? These were the questions that framed my original exposure to ketamine. The fact that it was rapid-acting antidepressant was a complete surprise to everybody. And so, as I said, I got interested in studying that aspect of it. I did have a very beautiful psychedelic experience that first day, which I remember vividly right up until this moment. And I can call on the images from that first journey, even now, to guide me. And subsequently, I went on to use ketamine in a maintenance regimen to help myself, along with a variety of other things, psychotherapy and oral meds and exercise, etc. We can talk about what that looks like. But anyway, I went on to use ketamine in a maintenance way over the last 17 years. I've had hundreds of ketamine injections, all in a supervised and therapeutic context. And for me, it's life-saving. And and I would just add that most of what I know about being a ketamine provider, I actually learned from being the patient. And so from that perspective, I actually think there's real value in ketamine providers having direct and personal experience with ketamine while acting in accordance with all local and federal regulations. But I actually think that informs the practice and helps people to be more compassionate and skillful providers.
Yes, totally agree on all counts. It would be somewhat unconscionable to not know what the psychedelic state is before just throwing it at somebody.
Well, that's the thing, right? Like, I come out of psychoanalytic training, and in psychoanalytic training, an essential part of the training is that you have your own analysis. You learn about yourself while also learning techniques for, working with the powerful tools of psychoanalytic therapy. And you wouldn't be allowed to practice, and you would never trust someone who didn't go through that whole process. And so I wonder about how we could implement something similar in the psychedelics and in the ketamine space. There's already precedent for that. How can we do that in a way that is legal and ethical? I think that's an interesting question.
So I wanted to back up to your first experience again. What was the route of administration on that first session?
It was an injection.
Okay, wow.
It was an injection of generic racemic ketamine, which, oh, by the way, is incredibly cheap. It's $1.59 right now, retail, to get generic ketamine as a medical supply. So less than a cup of coffee. Throw in 25 cents for the sterile syringe, and now you're at like $1.84, I think, for supplies. That That obviously doesn't include the provider's time, and it doesn't include all the rescue meds and equipment that we need. But just to make the point, Johnson & Johnson just came out with a filtered ketamine product that they patented. And it's not different or better than generic ketamine. But just as long as we're on this topic, do you have any idea how much it costs for their product?
Like $1,200 plus. We did a great article on this, and you helped us with it a while ago. Do you know the price offhand, though? I'm sure.
I do. $850 for 84 milligrams of filtered ketamine, compared with $159 for 100 milligrams of generic ketamine. So your listeners are smart; they can do the math on that. It's really hard. I can't think of any compelling reason, actually, that you would pay, such a radical price difference.
Well, let's talk about it further, though, because they're only providing it as a nasal spray, which uptake into the body is wildly variable. And there's no reason, and they're only patented it for one method or for one indication, right? Depression.
Refractory. It has to be refractory depression.
Oh, really? Okay, so treatment resistant. Okay, so that's a big deal. And in one of their licensed clinics, right? Like it has to be in one of their specialty. Yeah.
Yeah, they basically will make it available in any psychiatrist's office. And then outside of the psychiatry private practice, outside of that, there's a whole process for being able to dispense it. But here's the thing. Here's the backstory on that. So, a researcher over at NIMH, his name was Carlos Serrata, published a really important paper in 2006, so over a decade ago, about the potential antidepressant properties of ketamine. There was a whole history of this from before that, but that really is a landmark paper. And so after that time, every pharmaceutical company in this country and all over the world, everybody and their mother's brother tried to make a ketamine derivative that they could patent, because ketamine was off patent. The patent had expired, or maybe it was never patented. Maybe, I don't remember. But in any case, it was off patent and generic and dirt cheap. It's used all over the world as a surgical and procedural anesthetic. They're widely available in the medical community. Anyway, they were unsuccessful, and so was everybody else. They were unsuccessful in making a new medicine or molecule. And here's the reason why. Because they were trying to make a medicine that didn't have any psychedelic or psychotomimetic or mind-altering or visionary properties. And so they eliminated everything in the early phase of development, because everything that worked well had those side effects, which they considered to be a problem. I don't consider that to be a problem, but they do. Anyway, so then their next idea, when they couldn't make a new molecule, their next idea was to modify the existing molecule, ketamine, generic ketamine, in a way that they could patent. And so what they did is they filtered it. They ran it through a filter. They patented the filtration process. They removed all of the right-handed ketamine. The molecules bend in space. So they removed part of half the solution. They kept the other half. They patented that as S-ketamine, which is also called Spravato. That's the same thing. And as I said, they're trying to sell it to you for $850 for 84 milligrams. That's insane. It's insanity. It's medical extortion is what it is.
Right, which is highly rewarded in our country at this time.
I know. The whole thing just makes me nauseous. I mean, if they were selling it for $84 or $85 instead of $850, I would be advertising it for them for free. I'm all about, innovation is a good thing. But in this case, it's not clear to me that there was any actual innovation. The one thing, though, that Johnson & Johnson did that was good here is they funded the very elaborate and expensive research protocols and trials that are required to get FDA approval for a new indication. So thank God they did that, and they do have to recoup their costs in some way on that. But anyway, up until this moment, or up until March 5th, which is the day that S-ketamine got FDA approval. But prior to that moment, I spent a huge amount of time and effort in my teaching and lecturing trying to demonstrate or prove to listeners that ketamine was effective in treating depression and that it was relatively safe physically when used in a supervised and structured setting. And so that took up a huge amount of conversation. It was just proving those things, safety and efficacy. So thank God Johnson & Johnson did what they did, because now they've taken care of that for me. I no longer have to have that conversation. The FDA approval of S-ketamine, the filtered product, indicates that the FDA believes that it is safe to use in a supervised environment and that it's effective in the treatment of ketamine. Well, I've been saying that for 17 years, but glad they finally caught up with me. So right on.
Right. So who have been some of your bigger allies in this project you've been working on for over a decade and a half?
Ooh, that's a hard question. I often feel like I am functioning all alone in my own little corner of the universe. But I've gotten a lot of support from some of the other leaders in the psychedelic community. And there certainly is a tight community of ketamine clinicians that try to help each other. Some of the women ketamine clinicians have been incredibly supportive and helpful. So I'm really thankful for everybody who's coming together. And I actually think now that there's more acceptance now of ketamine and its therapeutic uses in the overall psychedelic community. And I think that's a good thing. I think we all need to come together and help each other. Primarily because what's happening in the ketamine world is just a few steps ahead of what's going to happen in the MDMA and psilocybin world as corporatization and big companies enter into the field.
Right. A past guest on the show, Dr. Brian Pace, he's really great. If you haven't met him yet, I hope you do. But he liked or helped me frame kind of this new landscape a little bit in kind of ecological terms. It's like there's not enough biodiversity yet for us to be kind of cutthroat with each other. And perhaps the large kind of elephants in the room like Johnson & Johnson or, I don't have a firm opinion on compass pathways yet, but I might in the future. Stuff like that could be really problematic for us and maybe, help each other, have some mutual support and aid and collaborate. And it's gonna take a village, and we've got a lot of work ahead of us on all of these different drugs, including ketamine still.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, things are changing really fast. Politically, medically, therapeutically, culturally, there's a lot happening. Yeah.
So let's talk about the different ways of working with ketamine, because there's a lot of different ways to work with it. I know people that just use it at home once a month to try to self-medicate. I know people that go to clinics, and I know not all clinics are created equal. So where do you like to start with this topic?
Yeah, this is a great question. Let's talk a little bit about the different paradigms for ketamine treatment. I think that would be really helpful for your listeners. So let me start by saying that there's a lot of disagreement in the field. There's disagreement about the route, how to put the ketamine into the patient's body. There's disagreement about the dose, how much to put in. There's disagreement about the frequency, how often you should do this. There's disagreement about how the provider should be with the patients, what your clinical presence should be like. There's disagreement about the importance of the setting as a variable. I think that setting is a very important variable in this kind of work, etc. And just as a side note, this was the reason that I created Kriya Conference, was to create a safe place for providers with different perspectives to share their ideas and educate each other and cross-pollinate and help each other. So let me outline for you a couple of the different dominant paradigms in ketamine treatment. So one way of working with ketamine that's pretty popular is to give it as a low-dose infusion out of the anesthesiology model. And so that looks like usually the providers give 0.5 milligrams of ketamine per kilogram of body weight in a 40-minute drip in an infusion center. So this particular protocol is often called the NIMH protocol because the National Institute of Mental Health gave 2 thumbs up to this as a protocol for treating severe and refractory depression. I think it was in 2017 that they did that. And so that's one way of doing it. Interestingly, many providers who work in this paradigm and who work in this way have anxiety that if the patient starts to have psychedelic experience, if things get too twinkly or colorful or visionary, sometimes the providers are fearful that it's psychotomimetic, meaning mimicking psychosis. And they try to medicate to dose under the psychedelic effect, or to treat it with benzodiazepines to prevent patients from having psychological experience. So in this way of working, the psychedelic component of ketamine is considered an annoying and problematic side effect that's to be avoided. And there's another thing to say about this, which is that for some people who are severe, again, we're talking primarily about people with severe depression and who have psychiatric symptoms that we're trying to manage. And remind me later to come back to the question of personal exploration, which is a completely different topic. But anyway, back to the NIMH protocol. Let's see. The thing is that some people with severe depression need a pretty substantial dose of ketamine. And so in order to get enough ketamine into the patient's body using this low-dose infusion strategy, what they do is they cluster a series of 6 treatments close together in time. So they usually do 6 treatments sometimes in 2 weeks or sometimes in 3 weeks. So the patient is being seen for infusion 2 or 3 times a week. So 6 treatments clustered close together. And the purpose of that strategy, it's actually called the Diamond and McShane approach. The purpose of that strategy is to get enough ketamine into the patient's body to do the magic thing that ketamine does in the treatment of depression, but without inducing psychedelic experience in any individual session. So basically, they took the total dose of ketamine that they want to give, they divided it up into 6, and they are parsing it out and giving it as a clustered series. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sounds expensive.
Yeah, well, we're going to get to that. Trust me. But okay, and so where was I going with that thought? And so this works. This is pretty safe, and this works pretty well for some folks. It can be very expensive, which is a drawback. But there's another thing that's a problem here too, which is that in this particular way of working, it really is a medical or a surgical paradigm where all of the magic or all of the efficacy resides in the medicine and not in the patients. And the patient is being forced into a passive role in their own treatment when you work in this paradigm. In other words, the patient isn't being called on to participate at all in their own wellness, except to show up for the appointment. And other than that, they're in a passive role. They sit there, they receive the medicine. The idea is that the medicine does whatever it's going to do on a biochemical level. And that's all there is to it. That's a medical or a surgical paradigm. And then the role of the provider is to keep the patient physically safe, which of course is very important, but that's not all there is to it with this particular medicine. I just want to say for the record that a medical or a surgical paradigm like this, where the patient is passive, is a wonderful paradigm for much of Western medicine, and specifically for surgery. You know, God forbid I ever have to have surgery. I want to say for the record that I would be very grateful to just lie there and not participate. I don't want to hold an instrument. I don't want to have to do anything. I want the doctor to do it. But the question that I have is that the optimal way to help somebody who is having a chronic mental health problem? So I think that this paradigm misses something. And so let's talk now, if that's okay with you. Let's talk about let's contrast that with a different paradigm for ketamine treatment. So here we go. Same medicine, ketamine, different philosophy. Same medicine, different dose, same medicine, different values. And here it is. And another thing you can do with ketamine in a legal and structured way is to do ketamine facilitated psychotherapy, which is very similar actually to the protocol they're using to study MDMA for PTSD. And so, but back to ketamine facilitated psychotherapy, this is a totally different idea than what we just talked about. It's different because here the emphasis is on the psychotherapy dialogue. And specifically, the ketamine is being used as a lubricant for talk therapy provided by an experienced psychotherapist. And we're using the ketamine to help people to talk about material that is too painful or too shameful to get to otherwise. And the emphasis is on the verbal metabolism of psychological material that feels stuck. So this really only works embedded in the context of ongoing psychotherapy. And I really want to make this clear to your listeners. It doesn't work as well if you just go to someone for a couple of sessions of therapy and ketamine, but you're not embedded in a psychotherapy relationship. That's not what I'm talking about. That's a little different. What I'm talking about specifically is when you're the therapist and you're seeing someone in a long-term way, and as a therapist, you have a pretty good sense of the patient's internal emotional landscape. And you drop in a little bit of ketamine, you add a ketamine session here or there to help the process along. And that can be profoundly helpful and can accelerate things. But again, the emphasis is on the therapy, not on the ketamine. The ketamine is a lubricant. So this is fundamentally a psychological or a relational model where, and what's important about this is that in this way of thinking about ketamine, both people in the room, namely the therapist and the patient, each of them are working equally hard on the patient's behalf. Each person is contributing 50% of the effort. The patient is not passive. The patient is actively participating to move themselves toward wellness by getting their internal knots untangled. So that's it. And again, I also want to note that in this way of working with ketamine, the psychedelic effects are also, you basically try to avoid them. You don't want the patient too far out. If the psychedelic effect is too strong, the patient won't feel like talking to you. They'll slip into a K-hole, and then they're too distant, and then you can't really do therapy. So again, in the first paradigm that I described, the medical model, and in the second one that I described, the psychological and relational model, in both of these cases, we are essentially trying to dose under the profound psychedelic or visionary effect of ketamine. Okay, and so that brings us to the third paradigm. So same medicine, ketamine, different fundamental idea. Same medicine, different philosophy. Same medicine, ketamine, different dose, different values, and here's what it is. The third model for working with ketamine therapeutically is to provide on purpose a psychedelic ketamine journey and to use injectable ketamine on purpose to induce mystical experience on purpose, because as a provider, you value that. You believe that the visions are meaningful. You're not trying to avoid them. On the contrary, you're trying to invite them. So I want to say for the record that this requires very careful patient preparation and patient selection before you do this. And just as a side note, only about 1 in 6 patients who approach me for ketamine treatment actually are a good candidate for psychedelic dosing. And I want to be clear about that. The number is much lower than you would think. There's a lot of confusion about this. But in any case, this is fundamentally, this thing that I'm describing, psychedelic ketamine journeys, this is fundamentally a psychedelic or a shamanic model, a shamanic paradigm, where the idea is that the patient is prepared to offer up their own body as a vessel, and that the visions that they receive are essentially a gift from God or a gift from the universe, or however you want to language that. And that the patient is in a state of minimal responsiveness, sometimes known as K-hole, for about an hour, maybe an hour 15, followed by several hours of quiet recovery and integration. And then the role of the provider in this case is to ensure the journeyers or the client's physical and psychological safety while they are having this profound experience. And then after that, the role of the provider is to help to assist the patient in constructing meaning out of what they saw, which is always ambiguous, and to find the message in the visions, and specifically to find something actionable, something that the patient can do differently in their daily lives to move themselves toward wellness in the form of an action that they can take. So I really want to emphasize this because it is this precise element, the actionable step, that in my mind distinguishes therapeutic ketamine from recreational use. In recreational use, you can get up in there and take a look around, and it might be interesting and all that jazz. But it's the actionable step that makes it therapeutic in my mind. And then you have to support the patient as the provider. You support the patient to make the change or changes that they want to make, preferably in baby steps. And sometimes it takes a whole series of journeys, of psychedelic journeys, to get the patient to where they want to go for the objective that they've chosen. But with each journey, there has to be a little bit of movement and actionable progress toward helping themselves. So in any case, so anyway, I've just outlined for you 3 different paradigms of working with ketamine. And so let me just recap. In the first one, the emphasis is on the biochemical properties of ketamine and what it does at a biological level. That was the medical paradigm. And then in the second paradigm, it was a psychological and relational paradigm. The emphasis was on talk therapy, on the patient talking while under the influence of ketamine. And then in the third paradigm, that was a psychedelic and shamanic paradigm, and the emphasis was on the psychedelic visions, hallucinations, imagery, and then how to make use of that. And so the question that I get asked the most often, as you can imagine, as a ketamine specialist, is can I have some free drugs? And the answer, of course, is no. But beyond that, the question that I get asked the second most often is, which of these approaches works the best? As a provider, what should I offer? As a patient, what should I seek? And so I'm going to tell you the answer. The answer is that they all work, and that different treatment is appropriate for different people. And that really is the essence of my job as a ketamine specialist, is to meet with a person who's struggling and to try to understand the nature of what's going on with them and make a suggestion about whether ketamine might be useful or not in their situation, and then to make a recommendation to my physician partners about what route and what dose I want to recommend. And everybody's different. This is not a one-size-fits-all kind of a deal. And so in my actual practice, here's what we do. We do it all. We provide a spectrum of ketamine services that includes low-dose infusion, moderate-dose facilitated psychotherapy, and high therapeutic dose psychedelic ketamine journeys. And we try to give people what we think is going to be the most likely to help them. I'm a big fan of treatment success. I want it to work. And I'll tell you the truth, a lot of people don't qualify for ketamine treatment at all and are referred. Everybody gets a treatment plan. They're referred for other interventions. So yeah, it's really all about, this is really the direction that the field needs to go, is being aware of the spectrum of services that's available and then matching the treatment to the patient, individualized treatment. So that's what I'm trying to do over here.
Yeah, that's awesome. We use a phrase here. You're not going to clean your whole house with a Swifter. It's not. There's multiple tools that need to be in play here. Like, it's great that you feel religious about ayahuasca, but it's perhaps not great for everybody in every indication. Same
That's
thing with
right.
breath work. I would love to be religious about breath work, but I just know it's not for everybody.
Yeah, and that's really clear about ketamine. It is not for everyone. Some people don't like it. It's not effective for other folks. As I said, I'm all about treatment success, and I'm all about finding new ways to make it economically more accessible. And we can talk about that. But yeah, we have to do this in a safe way. It's a very intense tool. It also can be very beautiful. So yeah, we just have to work together to get clinicians and patients more educated.
Absolutely. So let's come back to personal exploration with ketamine. You mentioned we might talk about that a little bit and what that looks like from your opinion.
Well, sure. So this is a much more controversial part of the field. And so this is really the cutting edge of where we are at. And it's really a question that I don't have an answer to. The question is it safe? Is it legal? And is it ethical? I guess that's three questions. But is it safe and legal and ethical to provide some form of ketamine treatment to a person who does not have a profound functional impairment? In other words, doesn't have an Axis 1 disorder. So there's no doubt in my mind that it can be useful as a tool for spiritual exploration for some people in the context of psychotherapy. And that's not exactly where we're at legally. The Board of Medicine or the Board of Psychology can come and audit or pull your license if they don't like what you're doing. And right now, the clinical indications for ketamine are all pretty impairing disorders. Maybe we should talk about that. The literature supports the use of ketamine. The literature supports the use of ketamine for the following 5 psychiatric or psychological disorders, namely major severe refractory depression, bipolar depression, physical pain with depression, which is a very common combination, ruminative or recurrent or obsessional suicidal ideation, and finally obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a very difficult disorder to treat, but thankfully this appears to be helpful. So anyway, if you're a clinician or a provider or a prescriber and you want to work with ketamine for any of these 5 indications, you are on solid and safe ground to do that. But if you start using ketamine outside of those 5 indications, that's something that you want to be thoughtful about. Although ketamine is on Schedule 3, according to the DEA, that's actually not the whole story about the legality of ketamine. And here's why. There's actually 3 agencies that have a say about what is legal and what you can do as a provider. And most people don't know that, but let's talk about that for a moment, since we're segueing into legality. And then remind me later to circle back to this question of personal exploration. So the question of legality, as I said, there are 5 agencies. No, that's not right. There are 3 agencies that have a say about what is considered legal if you are a provider or prescriber. And so here's what they are. There's the DEA, who keeps the schedule of what substances can be manufactured, prescribed, possessed, and distributed. There's the FDA, which says what indication a medicine can be used for. And insurance coverage is very intimately tied to FDA approval. So that's what that's about. And finally, the State Board of Medicine or the State Board of Psychology, or whatever board is overseeing your license, they also have a say in what's considered legal and ethical. So as I said, if you are using ketamine for one of the 5 indications that I just mentioned, as a provider, you're on really safe ground. There are some other indications, the list is too long to get into right this second, where we're currently investigating the use of ketamine where it's probably helpful and that will come into approval, the body of literature will support the use of ketamine for a variety of other psychiatric and psychological indications. But as it stands now, it's not exactly true that ketamine is a legal psychedelic. As a provider, you cannot just go shooting people up willy-nilly just because they want it, because it's not clinically indicated. It's a matter of clinical necessity. And so this is a conversation that we're having at Kriya conference and in many other pockets of the psychedelic community. Is personal exploration a valid use of these materials? And does the potential benefit justify the potential risks? I personally think that ketamine has tremendous value in a structured and supervised setting as a tool for personal exploration. And I want for everyone to be safe, and I want the providers to protect their licenses. It's a nuanced issue.
Yeah, it's one of the safest drugs, but for sure we do have to be really careful around it, and we don't want to be doing harm. Even if it's safe, there could be psychological risk, right?
Yeah, that's right. When we talk about safety, there's a couple of things. When we talk about safety, we need to consider physical safety as well as psychological safety. And so people certainly can injure themselves fairly easily under the influence of ketamine because it's anesthetizing and paralyzing, and that's concerning. When people are in a full psychedelic dose, they are essentially unresponsive to the external environment, and they need to be very closely supervised with respect to their respiration, their breathing, and also to the safety of the environment. So I'm hesitant to say that ketamine is a safe material. It's very safe when it's used in a structured environment by highly trained professionals who are experienced. Then it's quite safe. But used in any other context, I would not agree that it's safe. Then we come to the other issue, which is psychological safety and the kinds of experiences that people have. And I have to just tell you honestly that it can be very frightening if you are unprepared or inadequately prepared for this kind of experience. You don't want to throw people into the deep end of the pool. So these are all places where we need to exercise caution and good judgment.
I could say in the recreational side, it's happening a lot that people are getting really deep without the intention of that. In Colorado, I think it's happening pretty much daily, if not like over 10 times daily. The recreational, like the youth drug culture is really heavy with ketamine right now. I've never actually even touched ketamine, so I can't really speak about it that way. So for me, the number one, there's a number of safety issues, right? So like outside of a clinical setting, maybe we can run through them quickly. I know it's not necessarily your expertise, but falling down and hitting your head, being robbed, being abused sexually or otherwise. There's a number of risk factors if you do it in public at a concert venue or something, or at someone's house, because you're somewhat physically incapacitated, right? Like there's no... I'm really not even able to speak to that. That all makes me pretty nervous. Right. It's like this, Joe. It's like this. It's like an appendectomy or a root canal. If you go to someone who's highly trained, it's probably pretty darn safe and probably helpful. That does not mean that it's a great idea to whip out your kitchen knives, watch a video on YouTube and then give it a wingding in your dining room. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's all about setting and also about being with providers who are professional and experienced. So right. that's what I'm hoping for. Yeah, absolutely. Scott Shannon a while back. You're familiar with him? Yeah, he talked about how he does believe personal exploration is a clinical indication. I think it's a debate and there has to be consensus, right, before we can like really move forward with that. But that would be a really amazing thing if there could be consensus on the clinical side.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment.
Sure.
Here's the thing. So I made a pretty strategic and I'm going to say calculated decision a couple of years ago when I realized that I wanted to devote my career to this. And I but I imagine that there's this like palace of psychedelic experience that you can enter into, this beautiful palace, and that anybody who wants to come in is welcome. Is how I feel about it on a heart level. And I see that Rick Doblin is trying to, unlock or bang down the front doors to the palace to make psychedelic experience accessible to everyone. And I think that's great, but that's not what I'm trying to do. I have a different strategy. I thought that it would be effective to try to come in through the side window of the palace. And what I mean is, I thought that if I could demonstrate that ketamine is safe and useful for an expensive and refractory problem like severe depression, that I could kind of like crawl into the psychedelic palace through the side window of medicalization. And then once I'm in there, I could kick the door open from the inside. And so that's what I'm trying to do. And that's not a secret. And so here's the thing. The thing is that we accept, as a medical community, we accept that ketamine in large doses, anywhere between 100 and 1,000 milligrams, injectable or IV, we accept that this is a safe thing to do for people that are considered medically fragile. They do it for people in hospitals and at roadside emergencies. They do it to reset broken bones. They use it in combat medicine. They use it in children and in elderly people and in surgeries. So I don't think anyone's going to argue that it's about its safety for a physically fragile population when used in a structured setting. So that's part of it. That's on one end. And on the other end, the NIMH came along and said that low-dose sub-psychedelic ketamine is safe and effective for treating a psychiatrically fragile population. So like somewhere between like 30 and 50 milligrams IV for people who are suicidal and depressed or bipolar. These are psychiatrically fragile people. Or what I mean is people who are struggling and need to be treated with sensitivity and skillfulness. Okay, and so I wanted to establish those two things, and I wanted to get people talking about it. And I feel very successful that I did that in my efforts over the last number of years. So now we come to the interesting part. If we accept that ketamine is safe for a medically fragile population, and it's safe and effective for a psychiatrically fragile population. By the way, I know I'm going to get blowback for saying that. Sorry. But if we accept that as the premise, then we really have to grapple with the question, how can we argue that this is somehow unsafe for everybody else?
Yeah. For
all the healthy people who are not having a psychiatric disorder in that middle dose range, somewhere in between 50 and 100 milligrams. It doesn't make any sense. It's irrational to argue that somehow is not safe in a supervised setting. And so I think that's the premise of the argument that we hopefully will make going forward about the validity of the use of ketamine as an adjunct to psychotherapy. That said, under no circumstances do I think that we should be doing this broadly or outside of a structured setting. I am not in favor of that.
Okay, cool. I think that's really important for people to understand where particular people in psychology and psychiatry stand. Like, this is a really big deal. This is going to be a game changer for psychology going forward and treatments. Psychedelic medicines we have a broad portfolio, but ketamine's really like the one we can prescribe now and use now.
Well, actually, yeah, just to tag on to that, there's actually a couple of other things that we can use right now that are underappreciated. So let's give a shout out to those. GHB is Schedule 2 and is prescribable. Dextromethorphan, DXM, also an NMDA receptor, active also in the glutamate pathway is what I'm trying to say. That is over the counter. It's not even scheduled. Highly psychedelic. Let's see here. Cannabis, I'm sure people are familiar with. There are a couple of other ones. PCP, believe it or not, PCP is Schedule 2. It has a use as a human anesthetic. It's highly psychologically variable, so that's a problem, but nonetheless, it's legal. Let's
really
see.
interesting how variable the response is on PCP. That is one of the more interesting drug responses I've ever encountered in the literature.
So in any case, there actually are other tools that we could and should be studying, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
But back to the ketamine. Or I don't know what I was going to say about it. So, yeah.
Are you familiar with people using GHB or DXM in a clinical setting for psychological purposes?
Here's what I can say about it. I know that there's substantial interest in parts of the psychological and psychiatric community in the potential therapeutic aspects of those medicines.
Right. All right, good.
Was that evasive enough for you?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, right on.
The last thing I want to do is get anybody in trouble.
Yeah, me too. These are my friends. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
can we talk a little bit about group treatment today?
Let's go for it. Let's talk.
Yeah, thanks. So before we wrap it up, there's a couple of things I wanted to talk about. I want to return to the question of cost. I think it is the provider's responsibility to make ketamine treatment, and really all treatment, as economically accessible as possible. And so there's two strategies that we can use to do that. Number one, we can switch back to generic or racemic ketamine. It's dirt cheap. As I said, it's $1.59 for 100 milligrams retail as a medical supply of generic racemic ketamine. So, and then it's about 25 cents for a sterile syringe. So we should be looking at that as an alternative to the patented products that are very expensive. Number one. So that's yeah.
Cool.
And, I'm getting tired, but that's okay. Number two.
I've got go ahead.
Yeah, I'm hoping your editor is fabulous. The other thing that we can do is we can start thinking about group administration of ketamine. And so we've been working with that a little bit in our clinical practice with two providers. That's one medical provider and one mental health person, and up to six clients at a time. So the clients are very carefully selected so that they will fit well together. And then we are providing injectable ketamine treatments to the group. And what this does is it brings the cost down very substantially for each member of the group. And so there's something really good there. And so I think that's an avenue that needs to be explored more. And actually, I'll be giving a lecture about this at Kriya conference in the fall.
Excellent. So before we kind of wrap, I have one quick kind of chemistry question. I don't know where we'll go with this, but racemic ketamine, and there's other kinds of ketamine that I've seen on the market. I don't really want to talk about S-ketamine. I think we covered that a bunch in our show in the past too. But so what is the difference between the major types of ketamine that are available?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is, what is the difference between different types of ketamine? So there's three types of ketamine, or three preparations that you should be aware of. And so here it is. When you whip up a batch of ketamine in the lab, it's completely synthetic. What happens is that the molecules themselves are not flat, but rather they're three-dimensional, and they fold in space. They're three-dimensional. And so the little molecules are, some of the molecules are naturally occurring as right-handed. So imagine your hands and imagine the carbon chain as your fingers, and then the little side group as your thumb. So where the little side group lands and how the molecule is oriented in space determines whether it's right-handed or left-handed. And just as a side note, that property is called chirality. Ketamine is chiral. Your hands are chiral. Many things in nature are chiral. If you cut a shell in half, it's chiral. It has a right and left-handed side based on its orientation in space, although the components haven't changed. So with respect to ketamine, little ketamine molecules that are bent in one direction are considered right-handed ketamine molecules. And that's also called R-ketamine, spelled A-R-K, R-ketamine. It's hard to imagine. And little ketamine molecules that are bent to the left, that are considered left-handed molecules, those are known as S-ketamine, usually spelled E-S-K, S-ketamine. So generic ketamine, the original ketamine, when you whip it up in the lab, what you end up with is a 50% mix, 50-50 naturally occurring of right-handed ketamine and left-handed ketamine. And so the racemic generic means there's an equal amount of right-handed and left-handed ketamine molecules floating around in the solution. So as we discussed earlier, what Johnson & Johnson did is they invented or patented a filtration process where they took generic racemic ketamine, so a solution of mixed ketamine molecules. They ran it through a filter. They removed all of the R-ketamine molecules, the right-handed ones, and they threw them out, leaving the left-handed ketamine molecules in their solution. So it's also possible that you could do the reverse. You could filter it in a different way. You could end up with a solution of R-ketamine, and you could throw out all the S-ketamine. Or you could just leave it as it is, which again is generic racemic ketamine. I want to be clear that there is no compelling clinical evidence to date that suggests that any of these filtered products are in any substantial way better or different than racemic, generic, cheap ketamine. There's a lot of squabbling about this in the clinical community. There's confusion about it. The animal models show contradictory things. But based on what I've seen clinically, the evidence is not compelling.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. We've been going for a while, but this has been really great content. I've learned a lot, and I think everybody else will. So how can people find out about your upcoming conference? I guess that's in 6 months out, maybe 7 months out.
Yes, that's correct. There's a couple of ways to get more information. Thank you for asking. So I have a website, kriyainstitute.com, Kriya Institute, kriyainstitute.com. And there you can find a couple of things that might be useful. You can find information about my conference, which occurs in November every year. You can find a list of providers who are currently working with therapeutic ketamine. It's free to use that resource and to find people in your area who know how to do this. There's also a really useful list of books. I also collect journey music. You might enjoy taking a look at that. That's on my website. And also there's a link to contact me. So if people have questions, I welcome email. I'm happy to hear from folks.
All right. Well, I really appreciate your time. It's been really fun, Raquel. And I do hope we get to do it again. And I do hope we get to connect about the physician's course we're putting on and maybe put something together for those physicians.
Thank you. It's an honor. Thank you so much for having me.
And that was Dr. Raquel Bennett of the Kriya Institute. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, please do reach out via email or on social media. We're all over the place. If you want to email us, it's psychedelicstodayemail@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you and hear what you thought of that episode. And yeah, I guess that's it about the episode. So again, if you want to check out one of our live classes, there's a few different editions we've announced so far. There's an additional summer course starting on July 18 and 2 fall courses. The first one starting on September 12 and the second on November 7th. These are all 5-week courses supported by online live meetings, and they are pretty incredible. You get all sorts of content in terms of lectures on our teaching platform. Got about 10 to 12 master classes up there. You get copies of our ebooks and a new start to your learning. So if you want to dig into psychedelics and it's not feasible to go to a 6-month program like CIIS, please do start here. I think it's an amazing place to start in your psychedelic education. And even if you're an experienced tripper, this is really good stuff. So please check it out. At least check out our website and see what we have to offer for classes. And you might be surprised. Thank you all for tuning in again to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore signing off from Breckenridge, Colorado. See you in the next episode.